A pleasant day to you, icons and lady icons. I am Sir Leomered P. Medina and I will be your subject instructor for this course, General Biology 1, which is offered for the STEM students, which is considered as a specialized subject. For the very first module, we are going to talk about life in a nutshell. So, in module 1, we are going to answer this question, what is life? Now, if we are going to consider the definition from Fred Spires, life is a regime that contains the hereditary program for defining and directing molecular mechanisms that actively extract matter and energy from the environment, with the aid of which matter and energy are converted into building blocks for its own maintenance and possible reproduction. When it comes to the definition of life, according to Fred Spires, we can actually consider here the different characteristics of life. Life is actually possessing different types of characteristics, and the first characteristic of life that we are going to consider here is the concept of structural organization. Whenever we are talking about structural organization, it is just like the presence of different layers and different sublevels that is actually present on every single living organisms on Earth. Whenever we are considering the concept of life, all organisms are possessing here the term regime. Okay? From the definition itself, you can actually see here the word regime. Whenever we are talking about the concept regime, it simply means that all life forms are possessing a body. And when it comes to this particular body, it is now responsible for containing the source of life and the reason why different organisms are alive here on Earth. Structural organization is actually divided into different layers. The first level of structural organization, it is known as the cellular level. Cellular level is divided into atoms, then the collection of atoms will now create the molecules, then the collection of molecules will now create the macromolecules. Then, once these macromolecules are actually being used for the proliferation of life, they will now be formed as the biomolecules. Then, once the different biomolecules combine with each other, it will now create the different organelles that are now present within every single cell in our body. So remember, when it comes to the very first level of structural organization, we have here the cellular level. Then, it will be followed by the organismal level, which will simply start with the smallest unit of the organismal level known as the tissue. Tissue, it is just the collection of different types of cells. And once these different tissues come together, it will now form the different organs present in our body. These organs are just the collection of different tissues that will actually support a specific function. For instance, our skin, it is actually composed of different types of tissues. Some of the tissues that are present in our skin are alive, while some of them will be considered as dead. Some of them is responsible for protection, some of them will be responsible for the elasticity that is present on our skin. Then, the collection of the different organs that will support more generalized function, it is now known as an organ system. So there are actually different organ systems when it comes to our body. And as our discussion in General Biology, both for General Biology 1 and General Biology 2 unravels, we're going to consider these discussions from the lowest unit, which are the cells, to the larger unit, which are now the different organ systems, which will simply create now the organisms, which are the living species here on Earth. Now, when it comes to the organismal level of the structural organization, remember that the smallest unit of it is the tissue, while the largest unit of the organismal level is the organism itself. Let's proceed to the largest structural organization for all living things, and that is now the populational level. Whenever we are talking about populational level, we're going to start with the population. Or in the case of the population, it is defined as a group of individuals or of the same type or kind of organisms. For instance, as humans here in the Philippines, roughly around there are 100 million Filipinos. So that is the population of Filipinos. Then, the next one, we are now considering here the species. Whenever we are talking about the different species, for instance, the best example for this are the different types of dogs. Dogs in general, they belong to the species known as the Canis familiaris. Canis familiaris, it is the species, while the population, it is now the Canis familiaris of a specific breed of dogs. For instance, a population of Siberian Husky. That is a population of Siberian Husky because they are the same type of organisms. While on the species level, we are now considering here the scientific name, which is Canis familiaris, or also known as the common types of dogs. Population, they could be considered as the different breeds, while the species, it is now the specific scientific name, from the genera up to the specific epithet when it comes to their scientific name. Then the next one, we have here the presence of the community. The community, it is now the culmination of the different species that is coexisting with one another. In the case of the community, we can actually consider here our neighborhood. There's the presence of humans, then the presence of cats, dogs, mice, and also the presence of different insects. Those are actually community of different species. Then the next one, after the community, we now have the ecosystem. The ecosystem, it is actually the presence of the living and the non-living components, are also known as the biotic or the living component and the abiotic or the non-living component. Here in the Philippines, it is considered as an ecosystem because there is the presence of the non-living components, for instance, the presence of rock, the presence of sand, the presence of different coastlines, the presence of different mountains, and the coexistence of different community of organisms. So that is an ecosystem. Ecosystem, it is the presence of the biotic and the abiotic components of it. And lastly, the culmination of the different ecosystems and even biomes and even habitat that is present on Earth. It is now known as the biosphere. So once again, if we are going to consider structural organization, always remember the following. We're going to start with the smallest level, which is the cellular level, which is composed of the atoms, molecules, macromolecules, biomolecules, organelles, and cells. Then the next level, the organismal level, which are composed of the tissue, organ systems, and the organism. And lastly, the populational level, which are composed of the population, species, community, ecosystem, and the biosphere. So that is actually the very first characteristic of life. That life, it is considered as a regime. So you can actually observe here that we are considering the different characteristics of life based on the definition that is present on your module. Because that is technically the most comprehensive definition of life. And now, let's proceed to the next one. We know that life is a regime, and now it contains the hereditary program. And whenever we are talking about the hereditary program that is present on every single one of us, we are now considering here the control process. All living organisms are possessing these control processes. The control processes is actually present on our genetics. It is present within our genes. It is embedded in every single one of us. The reason why I am a human, the reason why you are a human, the reason why other organisms are behaving like this and like that, why we need to consume food, why our nails, even our hair grow, it is because of the different control processes that is present within every single one of us. And these control processes are actually being dictated by our hereditary program, or also known as the nucleic acids, either DNA or RNA. Other than the control process that is based on the definition, this hereditary program is now responsible for defining and directing molecular mechanisms that actively extract matter and energy from the environment. And that is now the responsive process. When it comes to the responsive process, it is now the time in which living organisms are actually possessing here the tendency to respond to the different changes that is present in their surrounding in a very meaningful way. When it comes to the responsive process, it is actually divided into three major types. The first one, it is the presence of irritability. Then the second one, it is individual adaptation. And the third one, it is evolution. How do organisms respond to the different stimulus that is present in their environment? In a very simple sense, whenever we are hungry, we want to eat food. We need to consume food because it is being directed by our genes, by our body, that we need to consume food. Okay? Whenever we are talking about the first thing that is stated on your module, which is irritability. Irritability, it is now the awareness of the different living organisms on the different changes happening around them. Other than hunger, there is also thirst. Also, the changes when it comes to the weather patterns and even in the temperature. Then after some time, after irritability, living organisms will now try to adapt to these different changes. If you can still recall the course of evolution of humans, we started with the concept of hunting. Then agriculture happened. Humans adapted to the different changes that is present in their environment. And lastly, because of these different adaptations, it now lead to evolution. Responsive process is the reason why our hereditary program can evolve to reach this pinnacle of organisms that we can now observe at the present. After the responsive process, going back to the definition according to Fred Speyer, life is a regime that contains hereditary program for defining and directing molecular mechanisms that actively extract matter and energy from the environment, with the aid of which matter and energy are converted into building blocks for its own maintenance. And the conversion of these building blocks are now present on our metabolic process. From the term itself, metabolism. Going back on your previous sciences, whenever we are talking about the concept of the metabolic process, we are considering here either the build-up or the breakdown of the different types of materials in our body. The sum total of all of these mechanisms and reaction, it is known as the metabolism. Metabolism, it is actually divided into two major phases. The first one, it is known as the breakdown of the different food materials known as catabolism. Then, the build-up of new materials that will be very vital for the sustenance of life, it is now known as the anabolism. Metabolism is actually divided into two major processes. The first one, it is catabolism, or the breakdown of food materials that we consume. And the second one, it is anabolism, that is now responsible for the build-up of the different types of building blocks that is necessary for the sustenance of life on Earth. Because of the presence of this process known as metabolism, our body can also do reproduction. And whenever we are considering here the concept of reproduction, it is actually related to the concept of the generative process. Reproduction, in this sense, in this particular jargon, doesn't mean the creation of an offspring. It simply means the creation of new cells. Okay? It is the reproduction, the regeneration, the genesis of the different cells that is present in our body. And the different cells in our body can multiply and divide because of the process of cellular division. Remember, whenever we're talking about the concept of generative process, it is not only about reproduction. It is not only about the creation of new offspring or organisms. It is actually about the creation of new set of cells that is responsible for the development and at the same time adaptability that is responsible for the growth and development of an organism. So when it comes to the definition of life, those are actually the different things that you're going to consider, which will simply give us the different characteristics of life. So this is the end of this video. Do not forget to browse and to answer the questions that is present on your modules. Thank you and see you on the next video.